like a movie, I guess. Like Star Wars or something, I don't know. Thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate that. Appreciate your flexibility as we've transitioned to this virtual environment as a result of COVID. Of course, this was actually the day we were supposed to have our flagship SALT Task Force meeting in Miami, but here we are in our kitchens or whatever. So anyway, but again, nonetheless, we welcome the opportunity to share ideas and share insight and expertise, more so than ever. Your research analysis and insight into how states are handling this crisis with respect to taxes and revenue streams are very important. So we appreciate our sponsors again for being willing to transition with us as we continue to engage with our members. Today, the topic, as you can see, is the pandemic and the damage done, revitalizing state revenue streams. For sure, going to be a very interesting and spirited discussion. Before we start with our panelists for today, I'd like to let our co-chairs that are both present today on the webinar to make some statements. Representative Abney, would you like to say a few words to our members today here?
Yeah, this is a scary movie. It's a trilogy. At any rate, no, just like yourself, I want to thank all of our colleagues who've taken the time out of their busy schedules all across the country, different time zones to do this. It's been a great joy. I hate to see it come to an end, so maybe we can think of some others that we can do this on. But certainly thank you to your staff, Erlinda, everybody at NCSL has been so great in providing us this information. And I certainly want to thank the sponsors without whom this would be difficult to do. And the presenters have worked hard to give us information that's important to us. These are challenging times that we're all dealing with. I think of us as being on the front line of democracy, and that the information we get from NCSL and from each other is helping in that. The diverse questions we get from diverse parts of the country are important for us to understand the big part of the program. There's just a shy less than 7,400 of us state legislators that are working hard for over 328 million Americans. So we are doing a tough job. We're on the front lines, and I appreciate that. And finally, what we do matters, and what NCSL does matters. Linda?
Yes, thank you, sir. And Representative Mako, I believe you're on the webinar as well. We'd love to hear from you if you'd like to say a few words.
Yep, I can't really add much to what Marvin said. He really nailed it, but I too want to just say thank you to the NCSL people and our sponsors. And Erlinda, you've been just phenomenal. I've had some issues the last couple of weeks from a personal standpoint. But even then, thank you for feeding back information to us. And Marv is absolutely right. We are on the front line of democracy. And I think we'll come back better. I have said, even as of March 12th, having been through so many different things, that the risk everybody takes is the concept of saying, yeah, but this time it's different. Nope, the boogeyman is always different, that's for sure, but it's not any different than the oil embargo and gas rationing of '74. It's not any different than the market crash in 1987. It's certainly not any different than 9/11. So we can't bet against America, and I think we'll get there. And I just want to thank you for all the support you guys have given the state of Wisconsin.
Well, thank you both, our esteemed co-chairs. I appreciate the compliment. That's what we're here for. So just doing our duty. But thank you very much. And all right, well, we'll get right into our panels now. And we have a slide with our agenda for today. And our first topic will be tax policy in the COVID-19 era. Bill Fox from the University of Tennessee is going to be addressing that issue, followed by revenues must be a part of the state solution to state budget shortfalls. States have many options by Mike Mazarov from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And finally, a presentation from the Tax Foundation, Gerald Waljek, the pandemic and the damage done, revitalizing state revenue streams. So we appreciate the three panelists that we have today. Jocelyn's going to be taking questions in the chat box. And if you could please just remember to mute yourselves when you're not speaking, that would be fantastic. Without further ado, we'll continue. Thank you very much.
Well,
Bill?
thank you very much. It is certainly my privilege to participate in today's session. It's always a privilege to be a part of an NCSL session. And as both of the co-chairs just noted, what you do really does matter in terms of the services that impact people's lives every day. You're the responsible group that we've elected. And so thank you for what you're doing. It's, again, always a privilege to be with Michael and with Jared, and they have great ideas. And so I look forward to this time together. So if we go with the slides, let me start by talking about two things. First of all, how I think about financing in this particular environment, and then some ideas that I would have on what kind of changes would make sense. And I think my basic theme is COVID-19 does not change good tax policy. Keep doing taxes well. And I have this fear that there'll be one group who are thinking just any way we can raise revenues is a good idea, and that's not good policy. Similarly, just giving tax cuts or granting exemptions in a hope to stimulate the economy is also not a good idea. When it comes right down to it, we are not having this problem because of state tax policies. They're not the problem. They're not the solution. Leave it to the federal government that can print money, that runs the Federal Reserve to stimulate the economy. All that we can do with new exemptions and lower rates is to further erode your capacity to deliver key public services. The next chart, well, I just remind you of the characteristics of a good tax system. Nothing new in this, but I'm going to focus on the fourth of those. But let me just remind you that limiting compliance and administration costs, this is an important goal. All the money that goes into those is just kind of lost from the economic perspective, though they're important to do. We want to limit the way that taxes keep good economic activity from taking place. We want an appropriate degree of fairness. That's in the eye of the beholder, but it's important to all of us. But the thing I really wanted to emphasize with almost all of my comments today is that in the COVID-19 era right now, these months and this year or two, appropriate revenues are a really key goal. And I'm not actually saying whether revenues ought to be high or low. They need to be the appropriate revenues to fund what you're trying to do in your state. But what I really want to emphasize is the need to think about the volatility of state taxes. And what's happened in really the last 40, 50 years, a long time period, is state taxes have become ever more volatile. A big part of the reason for that is we keep narrowing down tax bases, and narrow tax bases are almost always going to be more volatile. Now, let me be clear and say, it doesn't matter how narrow your tax base is, unless you're just taxing alcohol, you're probably getting hit pretty hard by this. And so I'm not saying there's a solution doesn't have some volatility, but you can reduce the extent. Taking the sales tax off food. I was in Utah 8 or 9 months ago and talking with the legislature there about this very issue. And I know in Tennessee, we have about half of the sales tax on food, and it's been an important source of stabilizing revenue so far. There are better ways to deal with the equity issues of sales tax and food. Progressive rates I meant to include here, and growing share of the income tax, I think is an important reason for volatility. Income taxes are not always more volatile than sales taxes, but in most economic environments, they will be. And then corporate tax revenues as we do it. If you're doing a corporate income tax, this is very volatile. And as I've said to our legislators here, a couple of months of no revenues is gonna just crash corporate income taxes. The next chart shows you how tax systems have been changing over the last 50 years to give you some perspective on it. The red line shows you the share of taxes paid by the sales tax. You can see it's kind of where it was 50 years ago. Went up a little bit in the mid 2000s, but it's stabilized back, raising about 30% of revenues. Income taxes, and I'm talking personal now, have almost doubled in their relative role in state taxes when we put all the states together. The outcome of this is a more volatile tax system, particularly those components of non-labor income. And what's actually different, of course, what I'm not showing you is the rest of the tax system. And what's really missing from this chart is the selective sales taxes that, if we went back 50 years ago, were such an important role in state government. I'm talking about taxes on alcohol, tobacco, motor fuel. I don't have insurance in here, but insurance taxes. And having a bigger role for those can help. Now, I'm not arguing to go out and put a massive increase on alcohol taxes or motor fuel taxes, but what's happened over time, because in so many states, you're taxing these with fixed rates per unit of consumption, you simply had no growth in the tax source. And so ideas like indexing those to inflation so that you get some growth so that their relative role in the tax system isn't eroded as much would certainly make a lot of difference and would have helped you in this particular environment. My next chart begins to talk a little bit about how I would be thinking about budgeting here. And I just wanted to remind you that in my experience, I've been doing this a long time. And in my experience, recessions are never single year events for states. You're going to, of course, be hard hit here in fiscal 20, again in fiscal 21, but the likely scenario, the one you ought to at least be planning for, is the problems at least go on into 22. Remember back, those of you who were in your legislatures in 2008-9, that not only did you lose revenues going forward from 2008 or 9, in many states it was 2012 or 13 or 14 before you had as many nominal dollars as you did in 2008. Plan for multi-year problems here. And so things like, well, let me just cover the problem with rainy day funds, in my estimation, is not very good policy. You need to be saving even into the future. That doesn't mean they play no role, but I know in Tennessee this year, for example, we're going to have to use some rainy day funds to close out fiscal 20 before we even get into the part of the year that we're planning for. And one reason why the recessions go multi-year, I've just noted here, your corporate income taxes, and I'm happy to talk about this later if anybody has a question, but just structurally, the way you've built them, the COVID-19 affects this fiscal year, next fiscal year, and fiscal 22, just by the way they're structured. And that doesn't even get into loss carry forward issues. Further, you ought to be planning for significant downside risk. Now, we all hope this doesn't happen, but nobody has seen a pandemic. We are, as I like to say to people when I'm talking about revenue estimating here, we are not doing forecasts, we're doing scenarios. We don't know what the outcome will be, and so we're sort of guessing and creating a scenario around, well, as long as there's no recurrence in the fall, this is kind of what will happen. But the key issue, the most important issue in terms of the economy, is when do consumers feel comfortable getting back out in groups, going to restaurants, going to concerts. I'm looking over here at the University of Tennessee football field. It's right to my right. When there are 100,000 people back in that stadium, when is it that consumers get comfortable spending again? But having said that, the supply side of the economy is going to matter a lot. I think a lot of trends in the economy have been accelerated, none more so than what's happening in retailing. And as you know, a bunch of retailers have already declared bankruptcy. There's more to come. And what this is giving them is an opportunity to try to right-size themselves. And so how will they do that? Well, they'll not reopen a lot of the stores they formerly had. That means a lot of people without a job at the other end of this. I want to remind you that many of you, if not all of you, have delayed filing dates for your personal income tax, for your corporate taxes. So that might have been good policy. I'm not questioning the policy. I am saying, as you're putting together your budget for next fiscal year, the challenge is if you have a July 15th due date now on your corporate income tax, you're not going to know until early August how your corporate income taxes did even this year. So you need to keep in mind that you're going to be planning with very little information. In Tennessee, they're putting together the budget in early June. What I've told them is that the best case we can see is 1 month of sales tax collections in a pandemic. We won't know about any of the other taxes. Very difficult environment in which to budget. For me, that means be very conservative on the budgeting side. Next chart just reminds us all of how volatile tax revenues are. I could have drawn this for any state. It would have looked very similar. This is what's happened over time in Tennessee with tax revenues. You can see how volatile they can be during a recession, and of course, how well they can do after the recession. The next chart brings us to what's different about COVID-19. As the co-chair Representative Macko said, this is clearly another one of the many kinds of experiences we've had. But what's different from anything I've ever seen is the pace at which the economy has slowed down. We shut things down, and we see it in two important revenue areas. First of all, if you're worrying about your unemployment insurance system, you're doing it with good reason. We've had as many people file for unemployment insurance in 8 weeks as we had in the first 70 weeks of the 2008-9 recession. What that means is that you're immediately paying out, it depends on your state, but tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars of revenue right up front in terms of benefits. Helping workers, no disagreement, but it really is hard on your employment insurance trust fund. Now add to that what happens on the tax side, and we can see that sales tax revenues are taking also that immediate crush in revenues. And again, this is not even dealing with the delayed filing you're talking about. And so it's the speed with which this hit revenues that is so important here. But forecasting how it's going to play out is very difficult. So be conservative, be careful. One thing I've noted here is what we've seen so far, and of course we're very early in this environment, is much more substitution across activities than I otherwise would have expected. Look at the next chart, and this is based on actual sales tax collections for Tennessee for the month of April. And if we can get that next chart up, what it shows is where, there we go, thank you. You can see where revenues decline. This is by industry. I have 500 or 600 categories. I chose a dozen or so to give you a vision of what's going on. So hotels and motels, of course, they were shut down. Restaurants, you can see them not totally shut down. And then in Tennessee, we shut down around the middle of March, and March's economic activity is April sales tax collections, and so that's a half a month of eating places. We lost 30% of revenues and so forth. But what I also want you to see is all those areas where we gained revenues. Notice grocery stores, as I mentioned before. If you're not taxing food for consumption at home, you're not going to see that kind of revenue growth that we were fortunate to get in Tennessee. But notice people apparently went home to work on projects. Their hardware stores and lumber and building materials did great. We had a lot of substitution. The question is what happens from there. This morning, retail sales for the U.S. was released. It was about 16.5% decline for the month of April. Now, that's a month later than what I'm showing you here. And I just noted, for example, vehicle sales down 33%, furniture store sales down 66%, clothing stores down, can you imagine, 90%. I mean, just huge declines across some things. But again, some growth, particularly in online sales. And so we can all be really happy that we had Wayfair-style legislation and how it's helped on the tax revenue side. The next chart just emphasizes what's been happening in terms of remote purchasing. I've argued for many years that the important thing is to tax remote purchases and other purchases the same. Wayfair has allowed us to do that to a significant degree. But I think it's important to remember that what's happening is more than just remote, me sitting in Tennessee ordering something from the state of Washington. A lot of remote sales now is me ordering something from the local grocery store and going by and picking it up. Target reported this last week. Get this, 275% growth in online sales this April by comparison with last April. And what Target has pointed out is that their fulfillment costs are down 90% if you can come by and pick it up at curbside, or if Shipt delivers it for them. And so what we're getting is this really big change in behavior taking place. We're accelerating a trend that was already underway. There's no going back. At the other end of this, retailers will continue to shrink their footprint. Again, Target, I'm just using them as an example. Target is already doing that in a number of cases. You can imagine what's going to happen is a lot of the activities of these kind of firms will be much more like warehousing. The notion that they're going to pay somebody to put something on the shelf, somebody else like Shipt or wherever to come and take it back off the shelf, and maybe a third person to take it out to your car. I mean, that's crazy. We're going to see employment losses. We're going to see space reductions and so forth in that area. Final couple of comments on remote purchasing. The destination sourcing component of this is key to the tax working well, and local tax administration does not work in the digital era. So an area where I know some states need to continue to evolve. In my next chart, I just emphasize where, in my view, our long-term goal should be. Now, let me re-emphasize, I understand what the Supreme Court ruled. I understand that this will take time, but it is not in the country or the state's best interest to have two tax systems, one for small businesses, one for big businesses. We need a single system that doesn't have thresholds and notches that give firms incentive to distort behavior. We want all firms to be considered in very similar fashion in terms of how they comply with taxes and the people that they represent as they sell. You may need some special treatment for compliance for smaller firms, but in the end, if you're operating in multiple states, I mean, just like I don't hire a lawyer unless I'm big enough to need one full time, I need to hire the service of a vendor to provide these fulfillment goals for me. The goal in the long term ought to be a single tax system. My next chart, I wanted to emphasize while we're thinking about these kinds of issues that federal legislation, I suspect everybody in this call agrees with me, federal legislation is a really bad idea to try to bring some kind of order in their view to state tax systems. Really easy to give away somebody else's tax base, get all the political benefits for exemptions and none of the revenue costs. And further, tax systems and the way the economy is altering is changing so fast. The federal government will never stay up with where it needs to be. Next chart. I wanted to just emphasize two things that I'd be thinking about if I was trying to stabilize state tax systems. First thing I would do is I would look at a gross receipts tax. Now, there unfortunately are more bad examples out there than good ones. I think the Ohio CAT is a really good tax system for stabilizing business tax revenues. No deductions, really low rate on all forms of business, levied at the destination. I mean, since many states are already going to single sales factor apportionment on the corporate income tax, just turn it into a gross receipts tax. It's a quasi gross receipts tax anyway. It's simpler. You don't have to worry about the combined reporting issues. Revenues are much more stable, doesn't distort how businesses structure themselves. The disadvantage everybody talks about is, but at pyramids. Keep the rates low like Ohio did, and pyramiding is not a problem. My next chart is to emphasize also the importance of keeping your taxes broad. Now, I've noted here you can expand the sales tax to appropriate services while that's happening, and I think I have a list here which I won't emphasize on what Kentucky has done. States still, when they talk about broadening the services, don't go out to the big ones. Healthcare, of course, is the biggest one. We could add, of course, and few people are going to expand to healthcare, but construction, repair services, this is where the money is really located. Keep the sales tax basis broad. The same thing with the income tax. Avoid age-based exemptions, which is kind of the current concern that I have because the population is aging so fast. Broader basis, more stable taxes. Last chart. I just wanted to remind you of this. This is the speed of adoption for major technologies and over the last 100 years. And I want you to look at what was happening in telephone, electricity, automobiles. It took 50 years, 60, 70 years to get these adopted. Look at the recent technologies. This is why it's so challenging for you to maintain your tax systems, and why it's so important for you to keep them maintained, because new technologies are evolving and being adopted so rapidly. So thank you for the time. I appreciate it, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions or comments.
Actually, if it's okay, I think we're gonna, well, no, we can take questions now, I guess, after each presentation. That's fine. Does anybody have a couple of questions they'd like to ask right now? And then we'll try to keep the bulk of them till the very end, though.
Linda, this is John. I just wonder if Dr. Fox could comment a little bit. You talked about, obviously, I think I understand the trend that was already underway, as you said, in retailing, and this only exacerbates that issue. But as we look at other recessionary pullbacks, is there any difference in your forecast moving forward? So I guess what I'm saying is, in your estimation, did we already have a sick economy that, so one argument might be that we've had a sick economy that was wasn't based on manufacturing, wasn't based on production, was based on the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualizing, and that was a thin economy to begin with. That's one train of thought. And that this was just an accident waiting to happen anyway, and this happens to be the current excuse that we're using for this consolidation and pullback. And the other is that, no, that's not true. That when you talk about the clothing, automobile, I know in talking to Senator Corker just a couple of weeks ago, they were working on getting the Volkswagen plant up in Chattanooga, and then they pulled back a little bit and got that going. Thinking was get some of these big pieces moving forward. And then that'll fix itself. So are those pent-up demands that are there? So I guess a little comment from you on what the macroeconomics are of what we're going into, if you've done any of that assessment.
Sure.
I guess the flip side of that, then the other side is that this was just an external phenomenon that applied itself to the market, like a 911 situation, for example. That was an external thing applied to the market, and that we were able to rebound from that once we eliminated that external force. So could you comment on that thought?
So I do expect a rebound from this. Not rapidly, and I'm not really negative on this. I just think, we're going to have the worst first 6 months of this year in the modern history of the U.S. You have to go back to the Great Depression to find an era like the first 6 months of this year. But I expect us to kind of grow from there. And admittedly, because we'll be starting from a low point after the second quarter, it will take some time to get back. And particularly in areas like you talked about, durable goods consumption. When buyers are nervous about their incomes and their fiscal situation, they're just not going to buy as many cars and big ticket items and houses and that kind of thing. And I appreciate Volkswagen down in Chattanooga, and there are two others near Nashville in Tennessee. And these are really important sources of jobs in Tennessee. But I think we need to also recognize that what people want to buy isn't just goods anymore. First of all, the single biggest item is healthcare. 20% of how we're spending our income, and this is a service, it's not a good. And go through the list. I happen to have not one, but two cell phones here in front of me. And while these are goods, the reality is once I get that good, I use it for the next 5-6 years, and I'm buying a service. I'm not buying a good. We have just radically increased the share of our incomes and the share of things we want towards services. And that's not going to change. Now, I'm sure there will be a lot of debate about getting PPE manufactured in the US and so forth. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but in the end, people are spending 60-some% of their income on services, 30-some on goods. And, in some ways that's helped in this pandemic in that we're able to deliver a lot of those services remotely. I engaged with my wife in some telemedicine a week ago with some people at Vanderbilt Hospital, and it worked out just fine. And that's an advantage over goods. Back to the specific example you were talking about, retailing, that was not caused by COVID-19. It was caused by technology changes that are allowing you and I to order and get things in new ways and faster. And if you have this may be you yourself or your children who with my daughter, I noticed, for example, I go to her house and she's ordering things for our delivery kind of through the day as we're planning them. This is the world that young people want, and the technology allows it, and it requires retailing to be dramatically different. And so it's technology and the new option to us and what people want to buy. That's what's causing this macro change. And COVID-19 only gave a whole bunch of people a chance to find out how easy it is to order from your local store and pick it up on the way by.
So then the follow-up of that, if I can, Erlinda, is, so then, Doctor, so would that be then, so that, are you saying, yeah, once that external stimulus gets removed, then we get back? I mean, I was looking at a Reuters report, and they're saying they're claiming all holy hell is going to break loose for the next 6 to 9 months, and they're telling it's just this terrible thought that this is just awful and this is what's going to happen to the economy. And then the last thing they said, but unemployment will be 5% by this time next year. And I go, oh, wait a minute, I can live with that. And so I just don't know, what your train of thought is on that.
I think that's a really optimistic scenario. We all hope they're right. So let me be clear. What I hope for and what I expect are really different here. I think that some of the changes that just took place are with us forever. And the retailing is the example of that. This, I think, look at Gap. Gap has 3,000 stores through its chain. They're reopening 800 up front. Now, I'm betting they never get to 3,000. I don't know what the number is, but it'll be a lot less than 3,000. Neiman Marcus is only opening 100 of 116 stores. What that means is at the other end of this, a bunch of people who had jobs aren't going back to them. And now there may be some jobs for them in other places. It's just that the frictions of getting them into these new jobs are likely to be a bit slower. And so I'm not as optimistic as to expect a 5% unemployment rate this time next year, but I am expecting the economy growing this time next year. But I think the challenge of education, which you all are so key and integral to, of making sure that workers take a chance. If I'm not going to work for 6 months, I ought to be upskilling myself. And what a great window to do it. I'm not working. I can take training to a technical school or a 2-year school online and learn things. And when I'm through this pandemic, have the opportunity to go back and have better job prospects. People really need to be taking advantage of this because there will be some frictions at the other end.
Thank you.
Okay, friends, we're going to take questions at the end, actually, so we can kind of get through our presentation. So
I talked too long.
Oh, no, it's okay.
It's my fault.
Actually, well, no, and normally we do wait for the end, but Representative Mako's co-chair, so he gets a pass. So, but we'll save the rest of the questions for the end if that's all right. All right, next presentation, please, is Mike Mazeroff from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Go right ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Erlinda. And
yeah.
Again, I appreciate the opportunity to present to the task force today, and my big takeaway is in the title of my presentation. Revenues must be part of the solution to state budget shortfalls, and states have many options for raising revenue in the current context. And the next slide sort of creates the context for that. It shows just how much more deep this recession is likely to be, how much bigger the budget gaps that states are facing are compared to even what we saw in the Great Recession, which up until that point had been the deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression. So the next slide, please. So what that graph shows is our estimates of what state budget gaps are going to be for the current fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, based on historical relationships between increases in unemployment rates and the current forecasts of unemployment rates by CBO and Goldman Sachs, and historical relationship that has found that about a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment is associated with a $45 billion increase in state budget gaps. Most of that, almost all of it, from revenue shortfalls, but a small amount from increases in Medicaid expenses. And based on what those unemployment forecasts from those two organizations are, we expect budget gaps, as I said, of $650 billion in the current and the next 2 fiscal years. That calculation doesn't include the direct costs in public health and medical care that are being imposed on state governments by the pandemic, although it is true that that's the one aspect of increased costs that, that the CARES Act funding for state and local governments can pay for. But if you leave that aside and look at the amount of money that states have received so far that's flexible, that can be used to backfill revenue losses, such as the increase in FMAP and the Medicaid match in the first coronavirus relief bill, and then the $75 billion in rainy day funds that states have, and again, assuming that they would use all of them, and of course they're probably not going to, they're going to hold on to them for cash flow management as well. We still see unfilled budget gaps of over $500 billion for those 3 years. So next slide. We think that closing budget gaps of that magnitude with state budget cuts alone would just devastate state aid to K-12 and higher education and healthcare, which those three categories by themselves account for about 3/5 of all state spending out of your own revenues, and that would be devastating to the people who are receiving those services. And it would also, the laying off of teachers, the laying off of highway maintenance workers and faculty at universities would lead to just an enormous withdrawal of purchasing power from state economies and deepen and prolong the recession. And we're already starting to see this. Just last month, state and local governments either laid off or furloughed in 1 month almost 1 million workers. So the first takeaway, I think, for you is that I think every task force member should be an advocate for more direct, flexible aid to state and local governments to help them backfill the revenue losses that they're experiencing and that are not of their own making. Now, granted, I understand there's a lot of controversy over the size of that direct aid, what conditions might be attached to it, how it might be structured so as not to compensate states that have mismanaged their pension funds and so on. But it's just clear that it's urgent that there be more direct, flexible aid for states beyond that will help them cope with the direct costs and instead will enable them to backfill their revenue losses, which is the major problem that all states are facing. Next slide, please. So regardless of how that all plays out, and it's clear that it's going to take a couple months to play out, the amount of federal aid that's likely to be forthcoming is just not going to be sufficient to eliminate the shortfalls that most states are facing. So my second takeaway for you is that states are going to have to take a balanced approach to closing their budget gaps. That is going to have to include revenue increases as well as tapping rainy day funds and no doubt cutting spending. But an all cuts approach to closing these budget gaps of this magnitude will just harm critical services and is just would be unconscionable and would drag down the economy. So next slide, please. So of course the reaction that many people will have to this argument is that, well, yeah, but tax increases are a drag on the economy too. They take purchasing power out of the incomes of people that are still working, and that's true. But there is a lot of analysis that to make the case that actually, if the choice were between cutting spending and increasing taxes to close budget gaps, that increasing taxes is actually likely to have a less negative impact, have less of a slowing effect on state economic growth than an equivalent dollar spending cuts. I'm not going to go through I'm not going to read the next 3 slides in which economists Joseph Stiglitz and Peter Orszag make this case, but the basic logic is, particularly if tax increases are targeted on people at the upper end of the income scale, that dollar of increased taxes that they are going to pay is not going to result in a dollar of reduced spending in the economy. They're going to make up some of that lost, that tax reduction on their income by drawing on their own savings or borrowing. And so, whereas the dollar of spending cut that goes to a teacher's salary, if that is eliminated, then that's likely to immediately result in that teacher spending less in the local economy. So this is sort of basic macroeconomics 101 applied to looking at it at a state level. And I think there is a very strong argument that tax increases, again, particularly if they're focused on people at the upper end of the income level, have less of a negative impact on demand in a state economy than an equivalent amount of spending cuts will have. Okay, skip 3 slides forward, please, Jocelyn. One more. And so, and I would say the previous slide showed that that a similar logic applies to imposing higher taxes on those corporations that manage to stay profitable. Of course, many corporations won't, and if you increase corporate taxes, it doesn't affect the corporations that manage to stay profitable, but during this recession. But for those corporations that do stay profitable, with demand so low in the economy, there's going to be, among those corporations, a significant increase in retained earnings that is not going to be injected directly into the economy in the short term because there won't be demand for their output. And so the same logic applies that if the choice is between cutting spending or imposing higher taxes on corporate profits that otherwise aren't going to be spent into the economy or aren't going to be spent in your state's economy, then that's preferable to an equivalent dollar of spending cuts. So what are some of the policy options that are consistent with this analysis? Well, that would include increasing personal income tax rates on the existing high income brackets in your state. If your constitution allows it, shifting from a flat tax to a graduated structure, perhaps phasing out itemized deductions at the top end of the income scale, corporate tax rate increases, or corporate tax surcharges on what might be considered windfall profits that some companies are going to experience during this recession because of the particular sectors of the economy that they're engaged in. And there are a number of people who have been talking about windfall profits taxes as we had during World War II and during the oil crisis in the 1970s, where you would enact a small surcharge on profit that's in excess of, say, an average of recent profit levels. Next slide, please. So in addition to the tax increases on upper income brackets and the companies that succeed in staying profitable during the downturn, there are a whole other range of tax policy implications of the situation that our states are in right now. And I think the most important way to look at this is to say that this recession is probably going to last a long time, at least as long as the Great Recession in terms of state revenues getting back to pre-COVID levels. And therefore, for the foreseeable future, every dollar of state revenue needs to be viewed as a precious resource. And there are lots of things that states cannot afford to do with respect to their tax systems at this time. And there are things that states have always needed to do, as Bill mentioned, and this is an especially important time for them to do it. So next slide, please. In the area of things that states cannot afford to do now is cutting taxes. And believe it or not, there are still states that are seriously contemplating tax cuts in the current context. There are a number of states that are in the process of phasing in multi-year tax cuts, and I would argue those should be suspended immediately. There are, as Bill said, some states that are tempted to try to stimulate their economies by, or otherwise helping businesses by cutting taxes. You know, businesses are in trouble right now because demand for what they're selling is plunging. So trying to encourage them to expand by cutting their taxes is the equivalent of pushing on a string. It doesn't work. Small businesses need aid, definitely, but the federal government, as Bill said earlier, needs to be the one providing it, and it is providing it. It's the federal government that can run deficits, states can't. They have to balance their budgets. Doing sort of across the board tax cuts for anybody in the hopes of stimulating economic growth is just not going to work right now. Next slide, please, Jocelyn. States can also not afford, in the current context, to remain coupled to ineffective or unfair federal income tax provisions. And as the presentation at the session last week indicated, for example, there are still states, a handful of states that are still allowing net operating loss carrybacks, and the CARES Act really dramatically improved them. And that is something that is such a self-inflicted wound in the current context for states to be allowing carrybacks. You're already going to see your corporate income tax, your current corporate income tax is plummeting because of what's happening, and the thought of compounding that loss by now allowing companies to go back and get refunds of previously taxed, previous taxes that are previously paid on earlier year profits is just completely unwise when states have to balance their budgets. Again, it's arguable, you know, for the federal government, that's a way of providing liquidity, but states don't have the luxury of that because of balanced budget requirements. Other areas of, other aspects of coupling to federal tax breaks that states should really take a serious look at decoupling from include full expensing. I gave a presentation to this task force about opportunity zones not being a wise thing for states to be coupled to. That's just as true now. There's a number of states that are still coupled to the pass-through tax deduction that the TCJA enacted, and they should decouple from that. And then there was this rather controversial provision of the CARES Act that greatly expanded the ability of pass-through businesses to pass-through losses to be used to offset non-business income. I think it seems like a great number of states are coupled to that, and they need to decouple from it. Next slide. So those are the kind of first do no harm things, classes of things that states could do. But they also, this is also a golden opportunity for states to eliminate their own ineffective or unfair tax breaks. There are still states that there's still a handful of states that treat capital gains more favorably than ordinary income. Not a wise policy. As Bill noted, one of the most troubling trends in state income tax policy is the growing exclusion of the growing number of tax breaks for seniors that are not tied to income at all, that are not means tested. States, as he said, cannot afford to do that as the population ages. There are states that don't tax any unemployment benefits, and obviously that would be a very tough thing to change in the current context, but it's really unfortunate. It creates a situation where you have a two-earner couple where the one member of the couple still has a high-paying job, but the unemployment compensation of the other spouse is completely tax exempt in 8 states. And finally, if there was ever a time for states to scrutinize and limit their economic development incentives, this is it. Sales tax holidays, another problematic policy. So next slide, please. And then finally, states need to close loopholes and fix long-standing structural flaws in their tax bases. And as Bill said, they need to broaden their tax bases as well. Examples that come to the fore in the current context, there's still only a relative handful of states that are taxing online streaming services, which is really unfortunate in the current context, where this is a growing aspect of the state sales tax base. Many states have never started taxing shipping and handling charges or tax memberships that provide discounts in purchasing, like Amazon Prime. We have the online travel company loophole that this task force talked about. We have the issue of international income, domestic and international income shifting because of the structure of corporate taxes that states have not addressed. So again, longstanding problems. Let's not let this crisis go to waste, and let's fix those problems and potentially raise some additional revenue at the present time. And then next slide, please. And then finally, I think another thing that members of this task force and other state policymakers can do is that they should be pushing Congress to take action to enhance state revenue raising capacity. So for example, they should push the federal government to reinstate the federal credit for estate taxes that the federal government took away almost 2 decades ago, violating a pact with the states that enabled states to have a uniform estate tax. And that's something that could raise additional revenue for states. They should repeal the prohibition on non-discriminatory sales taxation of internet access services, the provision of the Internet Tax Freedom Act. And I was really pleased to see that the Tax Foundation a couple weeks ago put out a report saying that states ought to be allowed to tax internet access services if they do it under their sales taxes. And I totally agree with that. There are a number of other things that states could do to eliminate preemptions and that states could do to push Congress to eliminate preemptions, as Bill alluded to before, and help them raise revenue. So final slide. So again, just to summarize, cutting budget shortfalls of the size states are facing through an all-cut strategy would be very harmful to the people who rely on state services in the current situation. Especially revenue increases must be part of the solution, and if they're targeted at people at the top of the income and wealth distribution and those businesses that do manage to remain profitable in the current economy, they'll have less of an adverse impact on state economic growth than an equivalent cut in services. And as I said, the current crisis should also spur states to fix long-standing problems in their tax structures. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Again, we'll be taking questions at the end if possible. Okay, Jared, take us home.
All right, thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to present today. If this title looks very similar to the title of the overall presentation, I didn't put a title on this, so apparently this is the title of the overall discussion today. But if we go to the first slide, I do want to talk about a number of options states have for revenue, and then some issues that you need to think through before you move forward with revenue options. Firstly, I agree with both of the previous presenters that there's an opportunity right now to clear out some targeted incentives in both the corporate and the individual income tax. There's definitely a reality, as you've already heard, and I won't spend much time on, that states are going to experience significant revenue shortfalls. There are disagreements on exactly how much that will be. For instance, Moody's, the ratings agency, indicates that they think states themselves will lose about $330 billion between fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021, compared to the baseline of FY20 projected revenues. You heard a higher estimate earlier. There are a range of estimates, both lower and higher. Certainly, states are looking at losing hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 2 years, and there will be further losses in the out years as well. This recovery will take time. There will be significant losses. Local governments maybe lose half to 2/3 of what the state governments do, both because they are smaller in their overall budgets, and also they do have reliance on a slightly better, more stable source of revenue in the form of the property tax, which is going to be much more stable in this particular time. But yeah, there are some opportunities for revenues that we can talk about, like clearing out those incentives. Michael mentioned opportunity zones, which states already had their own versions of those, but they often piggybacked on what the federal government did under the TCJA. But there are a variety of different economic development incentives that have a pretty poor track record. They're pretty popular, but they're probably not serving a purpose under the old environment. They certainly are serving even less of one right now. We do want to make sure that businesses have the ability to grow and prosper and really come back after this crisis, but those targeted incentives probably aren't the way to do it. This isn't a panacea. Sometimes we think of this as being an enormous part of the budget. In most states, it's not, but there's an opportunity to clear those out. Modernizing the sales tax is another important way when you're looking at revenues. And Dr. Fox talked about this, and there's two different ways you can look at modernizing the sales tax. One of those is to talk about the personal consumption of services that is usually untaxed in most states. A lot of that is just the accident of history that when sales taxes were created, these were not nearly as significant and were also harder to track. Some of it is the change in our patterns of consumption in very recent years. A lot of things that used to be goods, we now purchase as services, even though functionally they are the same thing. It makes sense for states to modernize this. As Dr. Fox already alluded to, think about the way that we're consuming right now and during this current pandemic. We are buying a ton of groceries. We are buying certain staples. We are getting streaming services. We are buying digital goods. We're not buying a lot of the traditional goods. And that really is bad for sales tax collections. So the services side, both for now and in the future, as a lot of the other activity comes back, that's a way to broaden tax bases, increase collections. It's also progressive in the sense that services tend to be consumed more by higher income individuals, and we are excluding those. The other aspect of this that I do think needs to be part of the conversation is the taxation of groceries. And Dr. Fox also alluded to that. And the immediate and obvious pushback is, well, that's regressive, that groceries are a higher share of the total consumption and of the total income of lower income people. And that's absolutely true. And it's a very legitimate concern. But this is poorly targeted policy because all of us purchase groceries, and those who are higher income are purchasing more groceries, often significantly higher cost groceries than lower income individuals, who, by the way, also purchase more prepared foods than higher income individuals, because cooking is in some ways a luxury, especially if you are a single parent household or a two-earner household. Cooking is a luxury. It's cheaper, it's easier to do prepared foods. Those are taxed. Groceries, the ingredients aren't. Some states have groceries in the sales tax base, but have generous credits, grocery credits, refundable within the income tax or within other structures to make sure low-income individuals get that relief, but groceries are in the base. I think that would look really good right now for revenues in a lot of states, but it's also good policy, something to consider. Obviously, states are also going to be thinking about new sources of revenue, and these are not immediate per se. If you tax gaming right now, well, no one's going out. Maybe you can do some online betting, but there's no sports. No one's going to a casino right now. But if states are expanding into this during a recovery, that is an additional source of revenue, gaming, marijuana, other things states are already thinking about. It's also a good time to think about inflation adjusting taxes that are eroding, like the gas tax. Many states have not adjusted their gas tax for a very long time. It has lost value over time. Now, gas taxes are ideally earmarked for transportation and infrastructure expenditures. They should not be going into the general fund. So it might not sound like that's much of a solution, but the reality is many states are subsidizing their infrastructure through the general fund, through other tax collections, because the gas tax and tolls aren't raising enough. Raising the gas tax in such a way as to cover more or maybe all of the infrastructure expenditures frees up general fund, frees up other tax dollars to higher valued use. And I think that can be very valuable right now. There was also a reference of the pass-through deduction, and that's something that we talked about a lot at the Tax Foundation. We thought it was bad policy when it was implemented within the TCJA. It's bad policy now. Most states do not conform to that because, generally speaking, you have to have a starting point of taxable income rather than adjusted gross income to conform to that. but a handful of states do and haven't decoupled. One state doesn't, but conform to it anyway. A couple states have it just separately as a partial provision. It's really not an economically efficient way of approaching taxes. The idea is theoretically, oh, the tax rates need to be equalized, corporate income, pass-through income, but the reality is corporate taxes are sort of double tax. Pass-through income taxes aren't. So it's really not a fair comparison. And that pass-through deduction is not an economically efficient way of providing for economic growth. It would make sense if states are looking for revenue to approach that. And something that wasn't on my list, but Michael mentioned it, the sales tax holiday. We've railed against that for a long time. There's really no justification for sales tax holidays. They shift consumption. They don't generate more consumption. They're administratively complex. Really not worth the hassle. And there's not a ton of revenue attached to that, but there is revenue. All of those things, I think, can make sense. Now, states want to be careful in the revenues that they try to generate because tax increases have consequences, but these are some things that maybe don't have as much of an economic impact. If there is a need for revenues, these are options. If we could go to the next slide, please. There are some things I think that we really want to avoid because we have obviously one of the steepest declines we have ever seen in this country economically. We're looking at more than a year's worth of the Great Recession compressed into a handful of weeks. We've seen that on unemployment with just unprecedented numbers, at least since the Great Depression. We've seen that with the business closures. Generally, this is a very different scenario. And businesses are going to struggle to come back. There's going to be an actual loss of capital. Businesses that go under, that just have lost everything. Businesses are going to struggle to rehire. And the first priority, of course, is to make sure that wherever possible, people can go back to the jobs that they lost. Now, there's important health questions about the when, and I'm not talking about when that is, but obviously at some point we want people to be able to reclaim those jobs or better jobs. And you could have really short-sighted policies that try to raise a little bit of revenue now, but do it at the cost of making employment far more expensive or making reinvestment far more expensive, because these things are going to matter. Businesses are going to have significant losses. We need them to stay open. We need them to reinvest. So I would disagree with Michael on some of the policies that he talked about. I would say avoid restricting your net operating losses. Remember, corporate income taxes are supposed to be imposed on net income. They are on your profitability over multiple years, because of course you could have a lot of profits in one year, you could have losses in the next, or vice versa. You want to smooth that. If you curtail net operating losses, you are making it much more difficult for businesses because you're taxing more than their profits. And you're making it difficult if they've had significant losses to have the cash flow that they need right now. The federal government has a very important role in that, but states have a role as well. The same with the net interest limitation or curtailing expensing provisions. It makes sense to ensure that businesses that want to invest have the capacity to invest right now. So I'd say caution on those things. Those are not good sources of revenue. Also, there's going to be clearly a desire to raise unemployment insurance taxes after the crisis ends. And that is probably necessary. There's just not going to be enough revenue to replenish these funds otherwise. But there's a really important timing issue, because we want to make sure, again, that businesses are able to rehire when the health crisis abates. And this is both any surtaxes or increased rates that may be necessary to impose during the immediate recovery, but it's also a matter of changes in experience rating, because the way the social insurance function of unemployment insurance works, you are essentially taxing businesses based on whether they've had previous layoffs. Those are charges against them. And this makes sense in normal times, but it's a huge problem right now. When businesses are forced to close, they've really had no option in many cases. They've had all of these layoffs or furloughs. We want them to be able to hire people back. And if those experience ratings immediately mean much higher rates on all of their employees when they hire back, that's a huge disinducement. And especially that's true if there's concern about a second wave and they're rehiring but don't know how long that will last. So a lot of states, I think 23 now, have frozen those experience ratings. That's a tax cost in a time that there's not a lot of desire for tax costs, but it's a good investment because it's allowing people to get off the unemployment rolls where that's a possibility and get back into employment. We also want to be very careful about taxes that are indifferent to ability to pay. And I saw a comment about speaking fast. I'm sorry, I'm watching the clock, but I will slow it down a little. We want to be careful about taxes that don't reflect or respect the potentially low profits, very low profits or losses that businesses are experiencing right now. So I would disagree with Dr. Fox on gross receipts taxes. I certainly agree that if you have a very low rate, like Ohio does, that even a poor tax structure can look pretty decent for a lot of businesses if the rates are low enough. Many states, of course, have had much higher rates on gross receipts, but fundamentally, it's just a bad way to raise revenue. It's a revenue generation source that has tax pyramiding, as he acknowledged, where multiple transactions are taxed, taxed over and over again on the same base. And it's also one where the different profitability, the profit margins of different businesses come into play. Think within the retail category. You have your boutique retailers that might have 30% profits on what they sell. There's also grocery stores that have what, 2% profit margins? If you're taxing them the same, those are really different effective rates that don't make sense when we have a much more intuitive measure, which is of course net income. So I'd say, that is not a solution. Yes, it is it is a stable source of revenue. I mean, so are head taxes, but that's not a good enough reason to impose them. Same with capital stocks taxes, tangible personal property taxes, things that are indifferent to ability to pay, things that are imposed on assets, even if they're not returning an investment. These are things that we should want to avoid right now. If we could go to the next slide as well. We should also think, as we're doing this, about modernizing the tax code, both because the current crisis is changing how our economy works, and because if there are revenue increases, it's a good opportunity to pair those necessary increases with serious reforms that reflect a modern economy. This crisis is going to bring about permanent changes, particularly in regard to employer and employee mobility. We've clearly demonstrated that it's no longer necessary for everyone to work in the same place as their employer is located. There are a lot of people who are not going back to an office, or at least not going back as often once this crisis is over. And we need a tax code that reflects that. So we should talk about modernizing tax rules to be friendlier to this new trend towards remote work and teleworking arrangements. This means that we don't have, hopefully, tax codes that, that have nexus attached just because a single employee is working in a state, especially for a short period of time. That we have provisions that understand withholding a little better, that a single day within a state working isn't enough to create a withholding requirement or reporting requirement. We need to start thinking about how nexus and apportionment and withholding all work in an economy where we have that greater mobility and greater flexibility. There was a brief reference to PL 86272. That is a safe harbor essentially for businesses that don't operate in a state, have no payroll, no property there, but do have sales into the state. If under current law, federal law, those sales are only of tangible property, then that's not sufficient for corporate tax nexus. The proposal that we heard was maybe you repeal that. I would say that in fact we need to modernize that's an important provision, but we need to have it reflect other forms of sales as well, because this is not the economy we work in anymore, where only tangible property makes sense. So thinking about trying to avoid needless double taxation that impact new economy models, being more competitive for businesses that do cross these lines, that's very important, and that's something that can be done, I think, in tandem with other changes that will, in fact, be necessary during this crisis. And if we go to the next slide. And there's an elephant in the room, and that's that we don't know what a new federal relief package for state and local governments will look like. It probably will happen. I think that is where we're heading. We don't know how large it will be, how many years it will cover, how it will be allocated, or how its use will be restricted. We obviously saw the HEROES Act come out earlier this week. That is the House Democratic proposal. It's about $1.1 trillion in aid to state and local governments. Of that, $996 billion can be deemed flexible or largely flexible, and $915 billion of that is the direct assistance to state and local governments with broad flexibility. And it can be applied to anything that is either backfilling revenue losses or is any sort of economic response to the crisis. An economic response to the crisis, I think, is a very, very flexible and generous term. Both tax and spending questions will be affected by whatever policy that is offered, because as mentioned earlier, there's about $77 billion in state rainy day funds. There's another roughly $15 billion in unallocated general fund reserves. So 90 odd billion dollars the states have in reserves. States will be making some cuts that will be necessary. States may be increasing revenues in some cases. And then of course, states will be receiving federal aid. If we could go to that next slide. This is what state revenues would look like. And this is just the state side, not the local side. This is what state revenues would look like if states spent their full HEROES Act allocations. And you can see that contrary to what you'd expect, fiscal years 2020 and fiscal year 2021 would be significantly more spending than in fiscal year 2019. Now, the yellow part or the orange part, that's dedicated funds, and some of it might offset things that states might otherwise want to do, but a lot of it really is responding to the crisis. These are expenditures you wouldn't have every year. But the rest of it, lop off that yellow or orange at the top, and you can see the increases. States under the, I said the CARES Act, I think the HEROES Act would have significantly more revenue to spend than they do right now or anticipated having in fiscal years 2020 and 2021. Now, maybe there's an expectation that they would continue to use this in 22 and 23. That's unclear, but the funding flows through by the end of fiscal 2021, and you could easily see states coming back. This is a lot of money. This is also probably not going to happen. There will be negotiations. I'm sure that whatever is offered will be less than this, but states want to take into account what they're getting because it may be very substantial. And you don't want to raise taxes substantially and receive so much money that you're growing your budget. This is probably a very inappropriate time to be spending more, especially outside of the direct COVID response, than you would be otherwise. But those are all going to be taken into account. Again, we're looking at probably 15–20% revenue losses for states for fiscal year 2021. Additional losses, though not that steep, in further years. These are serious. It's going to take an all of the above strategy. So revenues will be part of that, but be careful in how you do it. Look at this as an opportunity to patch some of the holes, to make a more neutral tax code by getting rid of some incentives that really don't work, by broadening bases wherever that's possible. Don't look at it as a way to target the sort of activity that we really need to happen right now, like reinvestment and job creation. But this is going to be pain for everyone. I just think that it's really important we make sure that it's an all of the above strategy. And with that, I'll try to leave a couple of minutes for questions people have for anyone. I'll just skip this given
Great.
time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Jared. Okay, I'm sure we've got a pretty lively chat box here. Jocelyn, do you want to run through the questions for us?
Sure. I think these next two questions are for Bill. What will cause a W recovery to result in a greater tax revenue loss than a U recovery over the same period of time?
Well, a W recovery, of course, is going to mean another significant slowdown in economic activity. So the notion is we come back this summer and into the fall, we have a resurgence of the pandemic, and economic activity slows radically again. It certainly would lengthen out the period of recovery. So that part we can be sure of. But it also is likely going to mean a deeper recession if it takes place. And so what will happen is sort of a deeper and a longer recession. I don't think a V-shaped recovery is on anybody's cards. I think everybody kind of realizes that's not going to happen. I've said from the beginning, what I'm expecting is the front end to be a V. We fall very, very fast. This second quarter is going to be extraordinarily bad when we hear the GDP numbers announced in July. And then we'll recover at a sort of, I hope, steady pace across the course of the next year or so. And so a much slower recovery than we went into it. The W just means we're on our way back and then we fall again. And so that clearly would be harmful to the economy, a lot more job losses, and a lot of revenue losses.
Thank you. The next question is, as retail shrinks their footprint, how do you suggest local governments proceed using this new available space? Should focus be on creating residential apartments in the space?
So I'm expecting, so COVID-19, of course, is going to impact how all of us think about the way we relate with each other. But I'm going to assume we're going to get through that, of course, over the course of 18 months to 2 years. And particularly the millennial and Gen Z population moves back to much more willingness to be around each other. And so what I'm expecting that will have at least as big of an impact as what we're talking about here is movement to autonomous vehicles, where we'll have a lot less parking taking place. So what I'm anticipating is less retail space and less parking, freeing up a lot of available space, particularly in the biggest cities, but even in towns, it will open up land possibilities. And so I think we as cities and states need to be really creative. How does that land get used? Now, some of it perhaps will be used to have people move from the suburbs or further out into cities, but it also opens up the chance to really plan cities better. Put in parks, for example, and make them much more livable environments. And so the combination of needing less parking and needing less retail space gives us a chance to replan cities that we really haven't had for 100 years. And so it's a great opportunity for folks like you all to help us plan better for a high quality future.
Thank you. This next question is also for you, Bill. What impact will the explosion of federal debt have on economic growth and the ability of the federal government to fund state and federal programs 5 years down the road?
Well, it's been my thought, again, for some time that federal deficits were rising without COVID-19. They were already $1 trillion a year and going to go up from there. My expectation was that was going to reduce federal willingness to help out states in difficult situations like this, and we're seeing the political dimension of that right now. I don't think that federal debt is so large, even after COVID-19, that it has to significantly slow down economic activity. We're going to end out, based on where we are today, with debt at about 100% of GDP. In Japan, it's 200% of GDP. But in the long term, it does things like raise interest rates. And that means a bigger share of federal funds go simply to pay interest costs. It means that businesses face higher interest rates when they borrow in order to invest. And so it will slow down the economy. And clearly, Congress needs to think about that. At the same time, losing the kind of economic activity we're going to lose in the short run is even more problematic. The best solution after we get through this is to have rational thinking about the size of federal deficits and rein them in. And maybe that requires some work on the expenditure side associated with Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, but it also is going to require some careful consideration of the revenues available at the federal government level. Long-term problems we need to address, not this year.
Thank you. What are the panelists' thoughts on 1, raising or imposing tolls, and 2, taxes on EVs to supplement gas taxes?
If I could jump in on that briefly, toll revenue, I think, can make a lot of sense. Now, in the very, very short term, tolls are raising next to nothing because people aren't driving substantially, and to the extent that they are, there's no congestion on untolled roads. But in the intermediate and long term, it does make sense. This is a user pays system. They can be an important part of a solution for making sure that transportation is funded through transportation specific taxes and allow other taxes to fund the rest of government. This is also significant with shipping and commercial transportation, capturing a lot of that as well. I think that makes sense. EVs, that's been really interesting because in some states it's been entirely uncontroversial to have special taxes on electric vehicles. In other states it's been extraordinarily controversial because it's a tax on something that people think of as more green, better for the environment, something that we want to encourage. But setting aside whether it's something we want to encourage, which perhaps it is, there is a challenge that it's outside of how we usually fund roads. If you are not fueling up, you're still contributing to congestion and you're still contributing to wear and tear. Eventually, there needs to be a way to tax those vehicles as well. I think for a lot of people, the long-term solution is a vehicle miles traveled tax, but there are complexities in implementing that, both privacy concerns and interstate concerns. It's probably a little ways off. I personally think there's room for electric vehicle fees to try to offset that, but that's probably a waypoint in on the way to a longer term solution.
I could just add a couple of thoughts on that. I've actually written a paper which is on the Pew Foundation website. I presented some aspects of that at a whole variety of NCSL meetings, particularly focused on autonomous vehicles and where that's likely to go. But EVs are a big part of the autonomous vehicle story because they almost surely will be, the autonomous vehicles will be electric. And so I agree with most of what Jared said, but in the long term, what you, in my view, ought to be thinking about is as mobility changes, the way in which we get around, we need to rethink the way in which we're taxing it. And the notion that we're going to impose fixed fees per electric vehicle, or we're going to impose gas taxes is really going to disadvantage people radically in your state. You can imagine, 5 years from now in New York City and Washington and the big city and whatever your state is, autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles are much more important, while in the rural places, people are still using gasoline-powered vehicles. And what you're going to get is big differentials as to who's paying taxes. What you want is a system where everybody pays taxes on their mobility, and that's going to require a whole rethinking of how we do this kind of taxation. As I said, you can see some ideas on that in this paper that's on the Pew Foundation website.
Thank you. Will temporary taxes be effective in helping state government recover? What are the best temporary options?
Well, I think we should remember that the experience of the Great Recession is that temporary taxes often aren't temporary. Now, sometimes they are. There are states that have, in fact, allowed them to expire, but frequently you get used to that additional revenue and do not allow them to expire. So I would encourage states not to adopt a temporary tax if they're not at least somewhat comfortable with the idea of it not being a temporary tax increase. Beyond that, just again, I think that base broadening is a far better policy, and that doesn't have to be temporary than rate increases. I'm not saying that's entirely off the table, but there are a lot of things that you can do to make your taxes more neutral and more efficient within the additional revenue goals before you look at tax increases.
I'd certainly agree with what Jared just said, that longer term solutions such as base broadening make a lot more sense now and always make a lot more sense, and they're things that should remain in place at the other end. Obviously, some particularly sales tax, temporary sales tax rate increases have been relatively common over the last 30 years. They are a way to raise revenues, but it'd be great to both raise revenues and end out with a tax system that operates better.
Thank you. What are the best ways to encourage small entrepreneurs to take that risk again and start a new business or restart one they lost?
Seems nobody wants to take that one on. Again, I think a lot of what needs to happen here is federal government solutions to this. The notion that we're somehow going to tax advantage small entrepreneurs to get them to operate again. But okay, so how do we do this kind of thing? We make sure that government operates well. What that means is we have only appropriate regulations. We make it relatively easy for firms to start up. We assist them perhaps with something a little bit on the tax side, but not really much. You're not going to incentivize through the tax system firms to get going again. Things like again on the education side, helping workers and companies know best ways to start a business, entrepreneurial centers, this kind of thing are likely to be much more successful than tax concessions or whatever to allow firms that are making little money to not also pay taxes.
Go ahead, Jared.
I would just reiterate one quick thing I mentioned about excluding from charging the layoffs during UI. And again, I'm not opposed to UI tax increases after this. States do need to replenish these funds. But if it's much more expensive for them to rehire employees in a month or 2 months or whenever it is appropriate in a given state to start rehiring, and if there is the concern that this could all happen again and that they could again experience that crunch, that's going to be a strong disincentive to rehire people until you're extraordinarily confident. And that becomes this vicious cycle. When are you confident if no one else is looking confident? So 23 states have frozen those experience ratings where a layoff that's directly responding to the COVID-19 crisis and business closures is not held against you. You're not charged for it. I think that's really good policy for now, and it will help states, help businesses in states reopen. I agree with Dr. Fox that we're probably not going to have tax policies that make the decision for businesses to reopen. There's so many other factors that are going to be far bigger than almost anything states can do, especially in the tax policy realm. But there are taxes that can stand in the way, and a tax on rehiring people, which that would function as, is probably bad in the short term.
Mike, if I could just add
I'd also reiterate the point that Jared made in his presentation about, taxes that are not based on ability to pay being an issue here. I mean, for me, that this issue is an argument for why you want to raise income taxes or corporate taxes rather than cut state aid to local schools, which is going to translate into higher property taxes that are going to be that a new business starting up, if they're renting a facility or building a facility, is going to be paying. So that's part of the benefit of income taxation, is that, businesses getting off the ground again are not going to have profits that are going to be taxed. And so it's preferable, if you need to raise revenue, it's preferable to raise income taxes than it is to create a situation where, other taxes like property taxes are going to increase.
I wanted to respond a moment to what Jared said about unemployment insurance taxes. And I mean, this is a really challenging area. In many states, this is automatic. You could, of course, back off on the treatment with the experience rating. But again, as the trust fund falls in most states, what's going to happen is the rate's going to rise even with no change in the experience rating of firms. And in Tennessee, the rates will triple, for example, as our trust fund comes down. And not only do the rates go up, but we actually increase the taxable wage base as the trust fund goes down. And so it would take much bigger kind of changes to prevent significant increases as the trust funds move towards zero. It's a challenging problem. The best solution with trust funds is build them up right during the good times.
Thank you. The next question is, I take it the new federal package will come out after states have to adapt their budgets or pass them. Also, our existing money is less than what is in the official statistics.
Yeah, I think that's right. One thing I liked about the HEROES Act is that it's paid out in 2 installments. I do have some issues with the way it's allocated, and also I think the size is perhaps a little generous. But it makes sense that there would be multiple installments so that states can adjust over a year or two of time. But that is correct, that states are probably going to have to, in many cases, already have budgeted for fiscal 2021. Most states have adopted a budget. But of course, they budgeted without properly anticipating these revenue losses in most cases. Even if you were adopting a budget in March and thought that things were getting bad, most states just trimmed. It was a haircut on their budgets. So this additional aid that might come is going to backfill a lot of those losses. It's not like states cut their budget by 20% and then will get the aid. They may have trimmed by a couple of percent or nothing at all. And I think that trimming by a couple of percent is more than appropriate, even if there is state aid from the federal government.
I mean, I think it is sadly true that that whatever the next package is probably going to be enacted after July 1st in all likelihood. But and that is really going to be terribly problematic for states that have balanced budget, that have provisions of their constitutions that say they must pass a balanced, must enact a balanced budget. It's really going to force very deep cuts. So I think that's an argument for the legislators on this call to turn up the heat on their congressional representatives to push to get that aid as soon as possible. And I also think, I mean, I also think there will, you know, that if by the end of June, there seems to be significant movement toward another package that does have some significant amount of federal aid in it. I think that's probably going to encourage a bunch of states to delay enacting their FY21 budgets in hopes that that the aid will be enacted, you know, perhaps by the end of July, say, so that they won't have to make such deep cuts.
If I could just reinforce the point that I made earlier, not only do you have no information about what the federal government might provide you, but if you extended payments or filing deadlines into July for corporations and individuals, you don't know very much about where you are in terms of your own tax revenues. And so it is an incredibly challenging time to be budgeting, and you have to make the judgment. If you are going to set a budget before July 1, then you have to make the decision, am I going to budget really conservatively because I don't know where either the federal revenues or my own taxes are going to be, and then if revenues turn out better than we thought, hey, we can always spend that down the road, or do we get aggressive and then need to do something during the fiscal year to try to make big cuts if the world plays out on the more conservative side? I can't imagine a more challenging environment in which to set a budget than right now.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions. And that's kind of a dramatic note to end our agenda today. But
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's true. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we are in some unprecedented times now, having to make decisions and really essentially vacuum in a lot of ways. So this is just the presentation today have been very timely and very important to our members and the sponsors that are here. So thank you all three of you for your presentations today. As is noted on the slide, we will be having our slides from this meeting posted on our website. So please do check that link later on for that. And again, we appreciate everyone's help today, and want to thank all of our sponsors that are listed here. As we always mention, you know, we are grateful for the support that you extend to our task force, especially during this time. And please do stay tuned for some changes and transitions as we go forward in the months ahead. Again, we are still planning on doing our in-person meeting at the Capitol Forum in December, where we hope to have our SALT task force meeting as a pre-conference event there. So stay tuned for developments on that and some other things that, some other seminars that we do plan on having involving you all before then. So please stay tuned and we'll keep you updated. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.